Father if he wanted all of this stuff to continue and to remain. And unfortunately, he's not going to pass that test. But we're seeing his greatness. And we talked about, when we were looking at some of his greatness, we talked about this particular statement, that the seeds of our destruction are often sown in the soils of our success. The seeds of our destruction are often sown in the soil of our success. And that sometimes our greatest assets become our greatest liabilities when we don't turn those things, we don't let God govern that asset. We can use it, we misuse it, we manipulate situations and people, and we get priorities out of line. And so what we're seeing is that Solomon has become everything that God said he would, and we left off toward the end, I think we left off around verse 11. We're looking at the visit of the Queen of Sheba, and we call this section confirmation because this is an outsider coming in who is herself extremely wealthy. And so if her estimation takes a lot more than, say, if you'd just taken a peasant off the street in Jerusalem, well, of course they would be wowed by what they saw. But when you have another person who is royal as well come in, it brings a different aspect to it. And furthermore, that she is not Jewish, she is a Gentile. So let's pick up, we're going to go back up to chapter 10 and verse 1 and read down, and then we'll progress forward. So chapter 10 and verse 1. It says, "Now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions," these riddles, political questions, dynamics of organization and how do you run kingdoms. It was common international discussion when they met together. And so she came to Jerusalem with a very great entourage and camels and bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. Obviously as a gift for her, which is something that was done then. Solomon's going to do the same for her when she departs here in just a little bit. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. And Solomon answered all her questions, and there was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. And so, it's kind of like you try not to be this person. Matter of fact, please don't be this person, any of us. But some people make it their mission in life to try and stump someone, and they study really hard to try and stump that individual. It's almost as if that's what she's done. She wants to see if he's legitimate, so she's studied really hard, come up with the most difficult questions she can imagine to see if she can stump him, to see if he really measures up. And of course, he does. There's nothing hidden from him. He's able to answer every question, whether it be... Remember, we've talked about in the previous, I believe it was chapter 4, that he has knowledge from a simple tree, from the cedar of Lebanon, the greatest of trees, to a simple twig that basically grows up between grows up between the blocks of your sidewalk. And so he's not just got wisdom, but he's got a massive encyclopedic knowledge of so many different things as well. And so he's answered on both accounts. In verse 4, "When the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more breath in her." She was just taken back by it all. "And she said to the king, 'The report was true that I heard in the land of your words and of your wisdom.'" We talked about how many times a lot of things are oversold. This is one of these rare occasions where it's not oversold. "And she said, 'But I did not believe the reports until I came and my own eyes had seen. And behold, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpass the report that I heard. Happy are your men, happy are your servants who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom." That is, so the people who served Solomon would have overheard conversations, would have seen him in the courts, and just being around certain people, you pick up and you learn. And that's what he's saying. Happy or blessed are your men or your servants who are able to, just by being around you, they become better, they become sharper in the way that they operate. And it lives out, really kind of shows the proverb of that Solomon would later write, "He who walks with wise men will be wise, and the companion of fools will be destroyed." You tend to be like the people that you were around. And that's not just an old lesson that we try and teach kids. That's something that adults need to remember too. You tend to be, You tend to be many times a composite of the 5 people with whom you spend the most time and the 5 people to whom you are the closest. There's a composite that rubs off on you and really shapes who you are. And so she's saying that they are blessed to be able to be in your presence on a continual basis, to watch you operate and to see how you handle situations. Then in verse 9, she says, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king, that you may execute justice and righteousness." Now, again, that's the irony of the book, which we're going to see develop. The irony is that here's a Gentile who can look at it and say, God put you on the throne, and you are blessed, and you're here to execute justice and righteousness. Why is that ironic? Because basically no king after him does it. A Gentile can see it so clearly. And it's in a sense of rebuke. When you come to Jonah, for an example, Jonah has a lot of interactions with Gentiles. In the first chapter, he interacts with the seafaring men on the ship to Tarshish. And then in the second half, he interacts with the Ninevites. And on both occasions, he's outshined by Gentiles. The prophet of God, who's the spokesman of God, it's the Gentiles who behave more godly than he does. And that is to his shame. And of course, that's always to the shame of the people of God when people in the world behave in a more ethical and a more godly way than the people of God. And that's something that comes up throughout Scripture. You can trace it. Verse 10, so she gave him 120 talents of gold, which we said was about 4.5 tons. A talent is roughly 75 pounds or so. Of course, their money was in measurement or weight, not necessarily in currency so much. And a very great quantity of spices. Where she was from in Sheba, they were known for their spices in the spice trade. And she also gave precious stones. Never again came such an abundance of spices as these that the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. And that's a consistent theme that's going to be seen as we look more at his wealth. Throughout this chapter, it's going to say never again, or never was there like this. Never did this ever happen again. And it's just intensifying the situation and showing us the wealth of Solomon. So in verse 11, moreover, the fleet of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, which we talked about toward the end of chapter 9, and it's a place known for its gold, and he has made expeditions there. It brought from him a very great amount of almug wood and precious stones. And the king made the almug wood supports for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, also lyres and harps and for singers. No such almug wood has come or been seen to this day. So again, you see that phrase again. Nothing like it has ever been seen, that amount. Now, what almug wood is in particular, we don't know. Obviously, it has a great deal of strength to it because he uses that for support, for the supporting of some of his buildings. So it's a very strong wood, but it also seems to be very beautiful. He's using it to make instruments out of, and so it's got to have some kind of appeal to the eye as well. Obviously, it's very expensive and very valuable in its nature, but it's all coming to him, and that's just part of his normal life. Verse 13, and King Solomon gave the queen of Sheba all that she desired, whatever she asked, besides what was given to her by the bounty of King Solomon. So she turned and went back to her own land with her servants. Okay, so she gets a departing gift. She brought him a gift, and so he gives her a departing gift. And then whatever she asked on top of Solomon's departing gift, he's like, yeah, sure, why not? And we're going to see later why that is. Gold and silver were silver definitely was nothing to him. And gold was just about the same. He had so much of it, yeah. You want a few bars? Here you go. It was nothing to him. And now, there's some interesting thoughts that have developed through the years concerning this text when it says that whatever she asked besides what was given her by the bounty of King Solomon, that's what he gave to her. So there is a theory / tradition that, I think my battery just, no, maybe not. There is a theory / tradition that says that she asked for a child. That she asked to bear one of Solomon's children. And at least that's certainly the tradition that is borne out in the country from which she came. If you fast forward to more modern times, if you ever go to Jamaica, especially on a mission trip, the main religion of Jamaica is Rastafarianism. Okay? Now, Rastafarianism, well, we're not going to turn it into a whole class on Rastafarianism anyway, but Bob Marley, Rastafarianism, he was major in that movement. But, so in Rastafarianism, they have this idea of an individual, of a Messiah that would rise within them. And they said he came from this line of the child that was born from the union of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Okay? So when we go through evangelistic processes in Jamaica, we have to kind of deal with this sometimes. And as a matter of fact, one of the main, when you look at the flag of Rastafarianism, there is a red line in it, or a red or crimson, I can't remember, it's one of the two. And that red/crimson line is indicative of what they think is of this relationship between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Okay? And so, whether it's true or not, we'll never know. Obviously, it doesn't carry with it the implications that Rastafarianism wants to put forth. But it is interesting. Some others suggest that maybe she asked to be married to him, and more like a formal thing. But anyway, here she is, and she's interacting. Now, let's look quickly. We mentioned it, I think, last or whenever we were together a couple weeks ago. I want to look at Matthew chapter 12 for just a second, because this is Jesus putting this historical event and using it for a teaching moment in his ministry. Toward the end of chapter 12, we're going to begin in 38. So he says, Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. Now, what's interesting is he's already shown them a sign. A demon-possessed man in verse 22 is healed, and they attribute the healing of Jesus to being in league with the devil. So they've already seen a sign, and now they're saying, oh, well, we need to see another sign. And this is why Jesus refuses them. I'm not going to give you another sign. You didn't believe the first one. What makes you think you're going to believe the second one? So we want to see a sign from you. But he answered to them, An evil and an adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. That is, his resurrection would be the ultimate sign. You didn't take this, although this sign of the healing of a demoniac person, of a demon-possessed person, is a sign, it's not as great a sign as what's going to take place with his resurrection. So he's saying, if you won't believe the signs I'm doing when I'm alive, the only other hope you have is to believe the ultimate sign, which is the sign of the resurrection, which ultimately they're not going to. And so he says, The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south, this is our Queen of Sheba, she will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. So what is he saying? How is he using this event and then transferring it to himself? Obviously, he's pronouncing himself to be greater than Solomon. As a matter of fact, in this chapter, there are 3 times this phrase is used. If you look in chapter 12 and verse 6, something greater than the temple is here. Jesus is talking about himself. And then you see the other 2 here. In 41, something greater than Jonah is here. In 42, something greater than Solomon is here. So that's a theme throughout the chapter. But his point to them was this. They had access to Jesus on a regular basis. Okay? And they would not listen to it. They wouldn't listen to it. And what he's saying is, you have someone greater than Solomon, me, in your midst. And you have me not only in your midst, but continually in your midst, that you can come to me, you can interact with me, you can see me. Even as, quote, common people, you can see me and interact with me, and you won't listen to me. Here was a Gentile woman who traveled 1,500 miles. We already went through all the entourage and all the difficulties that would take to travel. She would travel 1,500 miles just for a small window to interact with Solomon, who ran into all kinds of problems later. So he's using it to rebuke them and saying, why won't you listen to me? And that's the... it's interesting. We'll rise up in the judgment and we'll witness against this generation. It's an interesting thought on Judgment Day. I'll just entertain it for just a second and put it in front of you, and you can do with it what you will. So in Matthew 7, Jesus gets this picture when he says, "Not everyone that says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven." And then in verse 22 he says, "And many will say to me in that day." So he's the judge. He says, so many are going to say to me in that day, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, in your name cast out devils, and in your name do many wonderful works?" So what's the scenario here? They're standing in front of Jesus and they're pleading their case that they belong to him, right? And of course Jesus goes on to say, I don't know who you are. And then you take the words of Jesus here, they're going to rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. You kind of get, there is and it may just be a figure, a scenario in which someone stands up and says, "Lord, you have to be merciful to me here. I didn't accept you, but, I did try and listen. I tried to do certain things." And he's going to say, "Now, wait a minute. You had me in your midst all the time, and you wouldn't listen to me. Now, Queen of Sheba, come here. What did you do to hear an inferior wisdom?" So you see, it's like a courtroom scene almost, where you have witnesses that can rise up and refute the arguments of other people. I don't know. I find it interesting. I also find it interesting that, and I believe it to be true, but I've met some of these people. There are some people, you've ever heard somebody say there are people that would argue with the Lord himself? They will. That's what Matthew 7:21 to 23 says. "Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we cast out demons? Didn't we do many wonderful works?" What are they doing? They're arguing with him. So the weight of the principle for us is we don't obviously have Jesus in our midst in the physical sense of his incarnation, his ministry. We're seeing him. But of all people throughout the history of the world, as Americans, we're going to be held to a very high judgment standard. Because it was too easy for us to know about God. We literally have no excuse. We have Bibles, multiple, in multiple forms, in multiple versions, in multiple fonts. Of all people, we have no excuse for not knowing who God is, not knowing what God expects of us, and not doing what God expects of us. We have none. And now we have reasons that we tell ourselves in our minds as to why we don't spend as much time with Scripture as we should. But it's like one theologian has said, and I think he's absolutely dead on. He said, that phone you carry around in your pocket? He said, that thing may come haunt you in Judgment Day. Because when you look at God and you say, I didn't have time, all he's going to do is have to pull that thing up and show you how much time you spent on it. That thing will rise up in judgment and witness against so many people who said they didn't have the time for it, but they wasted hours on it. And so, this is about far more than just some ancient queen going to hear a wise old king. It's talking to us about we have a superior Solomon. We have the ability to learn all that we can. I mean, there's never been a time where we've been able to learn as much about Scripture as we can now. And the question is, are we listening to him? Are we going and drinking in from the well of that wisdom and instruction? And that's a personal question. That's something that only an individual can answer on their own. But it's something that we have to think about. And we do have to wrestle with it. Because, the tendency for human beings, myself included, is to kind of justify things and push them in the back of my head. If I push them in the back of my head, then it's not really real, right? But it still is. Still is. And just because nobody on earth may call my hand on something doesn't mean that God won't call our hand on something. We have to remember that. And be cautious of surrounding yourself with people who only tell you what you want to hear. That's not good for you. It's not good for me. And so we need this instruction. What this queen shows us is something we learn to deepen, hopefully, our relationship with God. Right? Back in 1 Kings 10, let's look at this catalog of his wealth. It's pretty immense. Verse 14, it says, "Now the weight of the gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold," or 25 tons, basically, of gold. And that's not all. That's not like a summation of his income. Like that's one stream of income, right? So when you're a king or you're a businessman, you're trying to, or even when you're looking at your own retirement plan, what you're trying to do is create different streams of income. You're diversifying and protecting yourself, right? So you have money in this particular area, maybe in a stock market, but you've got money over here because if the stock market is low, you don't want to pull that money out and lose immense value, so you want a fund over here you can pull from, and later, when the stock market is back up, you pull from it. You want streams of revenue, okay? You want different streams of revenue. And the 666 talents of gold are just one stream of revenue. He says, "And this is besides that which came from the explorers, from the business of the merchants, and from all the kings of the west, and from the governors of the land." This is not the money he's making in taxes. This is not the money he's making in all of the trading revenue that goes on in all these particular places. It's not all of his business ventures, which he's got a business venture we're going to see in a little bit about horses and chariots that he makes a lot of money on. And so he's got a strong, solid income. And then in verse 16, he has to do something with the money. "King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold." These would be large body-sized shields. Now, these are just ceremonial. He's not taking them to battle. Okay? They're just ceremonial. They're just to look at. Roughly 7 pounds each, 600 shekels of gold into each shield. And he made 300 shields of beaten gold, 3 minas of gold, that went into each shield, and the king placed them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Now, these 300 shields are smaller shields, would have been carried by like archers. I think 2 Chronicles 8 talks about the shield carried by the archer. But 2 Chronicles 8 or 2 Chronicles 14. But anyway. So we're getting the idea of gold. It's everywhere. Okay? It's coming in as revenue. He's using it to make ceremonial shields. He doesn't really need them because his father was so good to him, was so good as a warrior. He's put down all of his enemies. And so now he's just making ceremonial shields just to hang them in a banquet hall. Okay? I don't know about you, but I could find better things to do with money. I mean, he literally has so much he doesn't know what to do with it all. He has to find ways to spend it. Okay? So then in verse 18, he makes for himself a really nice throne. A king needs that. He's going to spend some time there. So the king also made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with the finest of gold, the highest of quality. The throne had 6 steps, and the throne had a round top. Now you can Google a picture of this, and it will give you a couple of different representations of this particular throne. But it's got the 6 steps, as he says, and had a round top, so a large area where the throne would sit, the throne itself would sit on this large top. And he had the seating, the armrests were 2 lions that he would rest his arm on, standing beside the armrest, while 12 lions stood there, one on each end of the 6 steps. So those 12 lions, obviously 12 tribes of Israel, they're lining those 6 steps up to his throne. Now notice this phrase again. The like of it was never made in any kingdom. First it's made of ivory, and then he takes something made out of ivory and he turns it into pure gold, or overlays it in pure gold. Then, verse 21, all of the Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. Silver was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. It was nothing. It was a waste of time. I have a friend that lives in Kentucky, and he used to be involved, was a manager in rental car businesses. And he had some of his superior managers, and of course, once you hit those higher level managers, you're dealing with, I think once you first hit those higher level managers, you're at $250,000 immediately, and then if you became a regional manager, you were more than $1 million a year easily. And so in one of his meetings with one of his regional managers, they're out to eat, doing something, whatever. And so he pulls out a wad of cash to pay, and he sees a $20 bill in his wad of cash, and he's like, these things just waste my time. The $20, it just wastes my time. I don't buy things. I don't use $20 bills. Everything that I buy is going to be far more than a $20 bill. What do I need the stupid thing for? Okay, that's a small window into how Solomon is. What does he need silver for? What is silver? He's got more gold than he knows what to do with. Then the king also had ships of Tarshish on the other side of the Mediterranean, the sea fleet of Hiram. And once every 3 years, and it was 3 years because of travel and the winds and currents and different things, weather and patterns that would make it such a long journey, they used to bring him gold, silver, ivory, apes, or peacocks, or some translations will say baboons, something others. So exotic animals. He's got his own zoo. He's just... Do you get the image that the guy, and this is really what Ecclesiastes is about, do you get the image of a guy who's got it all, but yet he's still got nothing? He's spending all of his money on all of these things, and it really just doesn't matter. And here's the difference, by the way, because we see his wealth in 1 Kings 4. But then we're given another category of his wealth here in 10. The difference is, in 1 Kings 4, his wealth was measured in food and the people who ate at his table and how he took care of other people, and now it's just all about him. The emphasis is all on Solomon. It's just about money. It's just about power. It's just about everything coming to him. And he's unhappy. He just keeps spending it, hoping that it will somehow fill a void in his life, and it never will. And by the way, when we talk about finance there, some people think making money an idol is only something that can be done by rich people, which, by the way, that brings up an interesting discussion about who is rich, but we'll save that for later. But love of money is not just for people who are rich. Love of money is just as much for people who do not have money, but all they can think about is money. It's the same thing. The only difference is one has it and one doesn't. But their mind, that's all they ever think about. That's all they care about. And so that idolatry can spill over into multiple arenas. 23, Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom, and the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. International sensation. Queen of Sheba is just one of a long train of people who came in. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver, gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, mules, so much year by year. I mean, the gifts that people bring to him, that dignitaries bring to him, is another stream of revenue. It's that much. And so Solomon gathered together the chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horsemen, which he stationed in chariot cities with the king in Jerusalem. Now here's what's interesting. He's building chariot cities. The guy's never been to war a day in his life. Nor does he have any prospects of going to war. Then there's another phrase about silver. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as a stone. And Jerusalem is a rocky region. And he made cedar, the expensive cedar from Lebanon, as plentiful as the sycamore and the shephel of the foothills of Israel, where you had sycamore trees growing leaps and bounds everywhere. He made the cedars imported and built with inside the city as common as sycamore trees. And Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Kue, which is most likely Cilicia. You remember that Paul, the Apostle Paul, is from Tarsus in Cilicia. Cilicia is a region. And the king's traders received them from Kue at a price. A chariot would be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. And so through the king's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. So he's not just taking them for himself, he's also turned this into a business that he now sells them to other people. He gets them at a price that may be the idea of he gets them kind of at cost, basically, not really marked up. You remember he has a tie to Egypt. And then he turns around and sells them for a major profit. Now, do these verses in particular, 26 to 29, do they remind you of a text anywhere else? In the Old Testament, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, in the 5th book of the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 17, God gave laws to kings. And he said, do not multiply horses. Do not make the people go back to Egypt to multiply horses. Do not amass wealth only for yourself. The only rule that Solomon has not broken of that list will be broken in chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. He's going to marry a lot of women and a lot of foreign women. God laid out in Deuteronomy 17 very clear rules for how kings were to operate, and Solomon is breaking every one of those rules in half. I mean, he's not even paying attention to them anymore. Which, by the way, Solomon, the kings of Israel and Judah, were some of the few people to ever own a copy of the Pentateuch, the Old Testament. Because one of the rules of kings was that when you became king, you were to sit down and you were to write, get a scroll from the priest that had a copy of it, maybe even just Deuteronomy, and you were to sit down and you were to write for yourself a copy of the book of Deuteronomy, and you were to study it every single day. This is one of the only guys that has a Bible. One of the very few throughout the first several thousand years of human history who ever had a Bible. He knew exactly what Deuteronomy 17, because he had to go through, there's something different. You can read something, but then make yourself write it. What does it do? It cements it into your brain because you have to slow down and you have to pay attention to how is it spelled. Is it singular? Is it plural? Is there a comma here? Is there a period here? Is there something else? It forces itself. It cements itself in your mind. He has written these laws with his own hand in copy. And he's breaking every one of them in half. And so when we look at the glory of Solomon, it's great. But we shouldn't just necessarily be blown away that he's also extremely wealthy. We should be somewhat bothered that he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing. He's breaking these rules. So, I haven't heard the bell, but I'm pretty sure that's... Any questions or anything from anybody? he was warned by, I think Joab of all people, surprisingly. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes. There really wasn't a king that I don't believe broke pretty much all. Maybe Saul, some of the explicit statements in it. But I don't know. Almost all of them multiplied wives. I know Saul had concubines, but I think he may have only had one wife, which again, you can get into that distinction as well. So, anyway, by the way, as we're reading all this, we're supposed to be looking at it going, is any king ever going to measure up to what God said he was supposed to be? And the answer all throughout the Old Testament is no. Therefore, when you come to the New Testament and you meet Jesus, and he's a different type of king, he doesn't care about the glamour, he doesn't care about the glitz. He has the heart of the king. That's what was supposed to draw people to him. But they missed it. So, anyway, we'll pick up there, chapter 11, hopefully next Wednesday.